The year was 1660, and the streets of London were alive with a mix of hope and tension. After years of chaos and bloodshed during the English Civil War, the monarchy was back. King Charles II had returned from exile, and with him, the old order. But the return of the king didn't bring the peace many had hoped for. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new storm. In the churches, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of angry sermons. The Book of Common Prayer was back, and with it, the strict rules of the Church of England. Bishops were once again in charge, and anyone who dared to question them was quickly silenced. The Solemn League and Covenant, a promise made during the war to uphold a strict form of Protestantism, was now seen as a relic of the past in Scotland. The situation was just as tense. The Scottish Parliament had decided that the bishops were the best way to control the church. This meant that many Presbyterian ministers, who had been loyal to the Old Covenant, were forced out of their jobs. They refused to submit to the new bishops and started holding secret meetings in the fields, known as conventicles. These gatherings were seen as a threat, and the government responded with brutal force, executing those who refused to conform. The years between 1660 and 1680 were marked by uprisings and suppression. In England, Charles II issued a declaration of indulgence in 1672, allowing Protestant dissenters like Presbyterians, Independents, Congregationalists, and Baptists to worship freely. But in Scotland, the struggle continued. The Covenanters, as they were called, faced harsh punishment for their defiance. They were hunted down, arrested, and sometimes killed for their beliefs. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 brought a new hope. William and Mary ascended to the throne, and with them, a new era of religious tolerance. In England, Protestant dissenters were finally given legal protection to conduct their own services. The Church of England, however, began to lose touch with the Reformed churches on the continent. In Scotland, the support for William came from those who favored Presbyterianism, leading to the restoration of a Presbyterian kirk. But this didn't satisfy everyone. Scottish Episcopalians, who preferred the old system of bishops, formed their own synods in parishes, which only became legal in 1712. Meanwhile, the Covenanters, who remained committed to the old covenants, refused to join the kirk. They continued to hold their clandestine meetings, keeping alive the tradition of gathering in the fields for worship and inspiration. On the continent, the Reformed churches faced their own challenges. In 1674, the pastors of Switzerland's Protestant cantons met to address the theological disputes that had been plaguing the Reformed churches since the rise of Arminianism. They produced the Helvetic Consensus, a document that reaffirmed the core beliefs of Reformed orthodoxy, including the reliability of the Hebrew manuscripts and the doctrine of predestination. However, this document also highlighted the ongoing debates and challenges within the Reformed community. In the Netherlands, the great defender of Reformed orthodoxy, Gisbertus Voyus, faced off against the new philosophical ideas of René Descartes. Boëtius argued that Descartes' emphasis on doubt and a mechanistic view of the world threatened the foundations of faith. In France, Louis Cabel, a Hebrew scholar, introduced new methods of biblical interpretation that questioned the reliability of the most widely used manuscripts. His work, along with that of Johannes Coxius, who developed a new covenant theology, challenged the traditional ways of understanding the Bible. These intellectual challenges were not limited to the continent. In Geneva, the younger generation of Reformed scholars, including Jean-Alphonse Turrettini, began to incorporate the new philosophy and methods of Descartes and Isaac Newton into their teachings. This shift marked a significant departure from the strict orthodoxy of their predecessors. By the end of the 17th century, the Reformed churches were facing a new set of challenges. In Geneva, the old Psalter was replaced with a modernized version, and the church began to introduce services on Christmas afternoons and other holy days from the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. The Company of Pastors even approved a Lutheran minister to conduct services for the city's German-speaking residents. The changes in Geneva were a microcosm of the broader struggles within the Reformed churches. The 30 Years' War, which had devastated parts of Europe, had left the Reformed stronghold of the Palatinate in ruins. The war had started as a religious conflict, but had quickly turned into a political one, leaving the Reformed churches in a precarious position. In Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, and France, Reformed Protestants faced severe setbacks. By 1700, the frontier of Protestantism in Europe had retreated, leaving Geneva as a lonely outpost. The Reformed churches in the Netherlands, the British Isles, and Switzerland remained strong, but even they were not immune to the internal dissent and intellectual challenges that threatened to undermine their foundations. The 17th century had been a time of great clarity and definition for the Reformed churches, but it had also been a time of strain and conflict. The future of Reformed Protestantism in Europe was uncertain, and if it were to survive and thrive, it would need new settings and new energy. In the 16th century, a group of French Protestants called the Huguenots saw the Age of Discovery as a chance to find a new home where they could practice their faith freely. One of their leaders, Gaspard de Coligny, sent Nicolas Durand de Villegagnon to Brazil in 1555. Villegagnon led a fleet of 2 ships carrying about 600 French people to a small island near modern-day Rio de Janeiro. The Portuguese had already been there for about 50 years, but left the French alone at first. 2 years later, more French people arrived, including 2 Reformed pastors from Geneva, Pierre Richier and Guillaume Chartier. However, the French colony faced problems from the start. Villegagnon, who was in charge, didn't agree with the pastors on religious matters, especially about the Lord's Supper. He expelled the pastors and their followers, and by 1560, the Portuguese had forced all the French to leave. Coligny didn't give up. In 1562, he sent another group led by Jean Ribault to settle in what is now Charleston, South Carolina. But this attempt also failed. The settlers abandoned the project within a year, and during their return to Europe, they faced starvation and even resorted to cannibalism. Coligny tried one more time in 1564, sending a group to establish Fort Caroline in Florida. The French managed to hold off the Spanish for a year, but in 1565, the Spanish attacked and executed the French Protestants, much like what happened during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. Even though the Huguenots didn't succeed in establishing colonies in the New World, their efforts showed that Reformed Protestants were willing to explore and settle in new lands. This spirit of exploration would later help spread Reformed Protestantism around the globe. The Dutch, known for their tolerance and commercial success, also played a significant role in the spread of Reformed Protestantism. In the early 17th century, the Dutch were exploring the world and setting up colonies. They employed Henry Hudson, an English navigator, to find a faster route to Asia. Instead, Hudson discovered the east coast of North America, leading to the establishment of New Netherland in 1614. New Netherland, which included parts of present-day New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, attracted a diverse group of settlers. The Dutch government, known for its religious tolerance, allowed people from different backgrounds to live and work in the colony. However, it took almost a decade for the first pastor, Jonas Michaelis, to arrive in 1628. Michaelis faced many challenges, including a lack of financial support, and a rough, unruly population. He described the Europeans as rough and unrestrained, but noted that they showed love and respect. The Native Americans, he said, were savage, wild, and strangers to all decency. Michaelius left the colony in 1631, and it wasn't until 1642 that another pastor, Everardus Bogardus, arrived. Bogardus had a difficult relationship with the colony's governor, Water van Twiller, and their conflict led to a dramatic chase through the streets of New Amsterdam. Both men eventually returned to the Netherlands, but their ship sank, and they did not survive. Johannes Megapolensis, who arrived in 1648, provided stability to the colony. He had been a pastor at Fort Orange, near today's Albany, since 1642 and was persuaded to stay in New Amsterdam. By 1652, the colony's needs had grown, and Samuel Drisius was sent to help. Both Megapolensis and Drisius faced financial challenges, but they managed to build and maintain the church. The Dutch churches in New Netherland maintained a monopoly on religious life, but as the colony grew, other Protestant groups like Lutherans, Quakers, and Anabaptists began to arrive. The Dutch pastors, supported by the colonial government, tried to restrict non-reformed worship. They also worked to improve the moral behavior of the settlers, who often engaged in drinking, fighting, and gambling. The pastors petitioned the government to close taverns and enforce strict Sabbath observance. Despite the challenges, the Dutch Reformed Church in New Netherland laid the foundation for the spread of Reformed Protestantism in North America. The colony's diverse population and the efforts of dedicated pastors like Michaelius, Bogardus, Megapolensis, and Drisius helped shape the religious landscape of the New World. The Dutch colony of New Netherland, which included New Amsterdam, faced many challenges. One of the biggest was not moral reform, but defending against the English. The colony had few settlers and limited resources, making it vulnerable. In 1664, the English, who never recognized the Dutch claim to the land between the Chesapeake Bay and New France, decided to take over. The conflict lasted until 1667, when the Dutch signed a peace treaty. For a brief time in 1673, the Dutch regained control, but they lost it again to the stronger English forces. Pastor Megapolensis advised the Dutch governor Peter Stuyvesant to surrender rather than fight. The Dutch directors later blamed Stuyvesant for listening to the pastor, calling him and others chicken-hearted. However, the Dutch were in no position to fight, and the pastor's advice to save lives made sense. When the English took over, they renamed the colony New York. The Dutch Reformed pastors wondered if they could still work under English rule. The Duke's Laws of 1665 helped by allowing the Dutch churches to worship publicly and granting religious freedom to all groups. In 1683, the Charter of Liberties and Privileges reinforced these freedoms, but also showed that the English king, James II, was more interested in populating the colony for business than in personal freedoms. The English government tried to resolve the issue of ministers' salaries. They set up wardens in each community to maintain church buildings and collect taxes to support the local minister. Since Dutch ministers were already in many towns, they naturally received the public funds, as long as people paid their taxes. The transition to English rule was mostly smooth, but the Reformed churches faced some problems. In 1688, Jacob Leisler, a militia captain, took control of New York. He was popular among the lower classes, but opposed by the upper class and the pastors. Leisler harassed the Dutch clergy during his 2 years in power. His execution in 1691 ended the immediate disputes, but the churches still faced a gap between the elites and commoners, which made it hard to get support for the pastors. Another challenge was the English government's support for the Church of England. New York's governors sometimes tried to appoint Anglican priests to Reformed churches. For example, Governor Edmund Andros appointed Nicholas van Rensselaer, a former Dutch Reformed deacon, to minister in Albany. The Reformed ministers eventually got him to follow Dutch norms. A similar conflict happened under Governor Lord Cornbury, who was hostile to the Reformed churches and tried to appoint Anglican priests. When Cornbury left in 1708, the new governor, John Lovelace, followed the terms of the charter that allowed the Dutch churches to worship according to their own rules. The experience of Dutch Reformed pastors in South Africa was similar to that in North America. The Dutch East India Company established a settlement at Cape Town in 1652 as a refreshment station for ships. The first governor, Jan van Riebeeck, was devout and supported the Reformed churches. However, he allowed only one Sunday service instead of two, which was the Dutch Reformed practice. Religious services in Cape Town followed a simple pattern: an invocation, the Decalogue, the Creed, scripture reading, and prayer. Congregations sang metrical psalms and sometimes collected offerings. Sermons lasted about an hour and focused on instruction rather than inspiration. The Lord's Supper was administered 6 times a year, and afternoon services featured sermons on the Heidelberg Catechism. The growth of the churches was slow due to a lack of incentives for Europeans to settle. In 1688, the colony received an influx of Huguenot refugees who brought a new minister, Pierre Simond. He became popular and stayed until 1702. However, when his congregation asked for a separate church, the colonial officials refused, seeing all churches as extensions of the secular authorities. Despite the challenges, Reformed churches in both North America and South Africa eventually established an independent existence and prospered. They became centers of Reformed Protestantism that would rival and eventually surpass the national churches in Europe. In contrast, the English Puritans who migrated to North America between 1620 and 1641 were driven by religious motives. About 21,000 Puritans, including 76 ordained ministers, left England for the New World. They faced harsh conditions, but were motivated by their desire for a pure and spiritual expression of Christianity. One of the key figures was John Winthrop, who had a deep religious devotion. He practiced a form of congregationalism where believers met in small groups to maintain their faith. Another important figure was William Bradford, who was part of a group that left for the Netherlands to avoid persecution. In 1607, the group moved to Leiden, and in 1620 they set sail for North America on the Mayflower, landing at Plymouth. The first winter was harsh, and half the colonists died, but a successful harvest the next year led to a Thanksgiving celebration, which later became a national holiday. The Pilgrims were followed by more Puritans, and by 1630, Plymouth Colony had grown to about 300 colonists. These settlers laid the foundation for a new society based on their religious beliefs and values. John Winthrop led the second group of Puritan settlers to the New World in 1630. This move was driven by the political and religious tensions in England. In 1625, Charles I became king, and his policies were a major concern for the Puritans. Charles was married to a Roman Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France, and his religious policies favored formality and uniformity, which were the opposite of what the Puritans believed. His Archbishop, William Laud, enforced these policies and began to persecute nonconformists, which included the Puritans. This made many Puritans fear for their lives and their faith, leading them to seek a new home where they could practice their religion freely. Before Winthrop's group left for the New World, John Endicott was already in Salem, making preparations for the colony. Salem was the original center of the colony, and it was where the first congregation was established. The first pastors were Samuel Skelton and Francis Higginson. Higginson, a graduate of Cambridge University, was disillusioned with the Church of England and saw the opportunity to minister without the restrictions imposed by the king and his archbishop. He helped draft the first rules for the church, which gave church members the power to choose and ordain their pastors and required them to sign a covenant. This covenant was a promise to follow Christ and to oppose any practices that went against their beliefs. However, not everyone in Salem agreed with the new church structure. The Brown brothers, Samuel and John, believed that the pastors were too separatist and were moving towards Anabaptism, a group that the Puritans distrusted. The Browns began holding separate meetings that followed the Book of Common Prayer, which was the official prayer book of the Church of England. This caused tension, and Endicott ordered the Browns back to England to address their complaints with the company's directors. The issue remained unresolved, but it highlighted the challenges the Puritans faced in maintaining unity. Despite these challenges, the Puritans' charter from the Massachusetts Bay Company gave them a unique advantage. The charter allowed the settlers to buy stock in the company, effectively making them the governors. This meant that the settlers could make decisions without interference from the directors in London. This freedom was crucial for the Puritans, who wanted to create a society based on their religious beliefs. On the journey to the New World, John Winthrop delivered a speech called A Model of Christian Charity. This speech emphasized the importance of community and charity among the settlers. Winthrop warned that if they strayed from their faith and pursued personal gain, they would face God's judgment. He used the image of a city on a hill to describe the colony, meaning that their actions would be a model for others to see. Winthrop's speech also addressed the economic disparities among the settlers, urging those with more to help those with less. He believed that this was essential for the survival and success of the colony. Once in the New World, the Puritans had the opportunity to create a society that aligned with their religious ideals. They drew inspiration from the laws and regulations of the Old Testament for their civil government and developed a form of church governance called Congregationalism. This system gave each church congregation the authority to make its own decisions, which was different from the hierarchical structure of the Church of England. The Puritans also placed a high value on education, and within the first decade they established Harvard College to train ministers and other professionals. In 1636, Thomas Hooker, another Puritan leader, founded the colony of Connecticut. Hooker had fled England due to his Puritan practices and later became a pastor in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He believed in extending voting rights to all church members, both in civil and ecclesiastical matters. This led him to establish a new colony where he could implement his ideas. Connecticut eventually absorbed two other Puritan settlements: Saybrook, founded by John Winthrop Jr., and New Haven, led by John Davenport. These colonies joined Connecticut after the restoration of the English monarchy in 1662. Another significant figure in the Puritan movement was Roger Williams. Williams, a Cambridge graduate, refused to minister in the Church of England because he believed the church needed to be free from civil control. After arriving in Boston in 1631, Williams criticized the Massachusetts clergy and the king, which made him a liability. In 1636, he was banished from Massachusetts and founded the colony of Rhode Island. Williams became a Baptist and advocated for religious freedom, making Rhode Island a haven for those who could not conform to Puritan standards. The Puritans in Massachusetts faced a major theological controversy in 1636 to 1638, known as the Antinomian Controversy. At the center of this controversy was Anne Hutchinson, a respected member of the Boston congregation. Hutchinson held meetings in her home to discuss the sermons of John Cotton, the associate pastor in Boston. Her discussions revealed a tension between Cotton and the other pastor, John Wilson, over the role of good works in a Christian's life. Hutchinson believed that true faith could be confirmed through internal experiences, such as the Holy Spirit, rather than through external actions. This view was seen as dangerous because it could undermine the colony's laws and religious practices. The controversy led to Hutchinson's excommunication and her move to Rhode Island. The Antinomian Controversy highlighted the challenges of congregational polity, where each church congregation had significant autonomy. Some Puritans, like John Eliot, advocated for a Presbyterian form of church government, which would allow for more centralized control. However, the Cambridge Platform, adopted in 1648, confirmed the independence of individual congregations and the power of the laity. This document affirmed the importance of church covenants and the need for pastors and other church officers. But it also maintained the autonomy of each congregation. The Puritans' journey to the New World and their efforts to create a society based on their religious beliefs were filled with challenges and controversies. Despite these difficulties, they managed to establish a unique and influential community that would shape the future of America. The Puritans in New England were a tight-knit community, but they couldn't ignore what was happening in England. When the Puritans gained power in Parliament and Oliver Cromwell led the new model army, many Puritans in New England felt a strong pull to return to their homeland. William Bradford, a key figure in the colony, estimated that half of New England's intellectual leaders went back to England during this time. John Cotton, a respected Puritan minister, was asked to return to help defend Congregationalism, but he stayed in New England and wrote a book instead. The Massachusetts authorities also sent several prominent figures, including Hugh Peter, William Hiddens, Thomas Weld, and John Winthrop Jr., to support the Puritan cause in England. Hugh Peter became a chaplain in Parliament's army and a close friend of Cromwell. When Peter wrote to John Winthrop, the elder, asking him to return to England, the people of Massachusetts worried that if he left, he might be elected to Parliament and never come back. The Puritans in England were divided, with Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and Independents all vying for influence. The Westminster Assembly, a group of religious leaders, was dominated by Presbyterians, and only a few advocated for Congregationalism. After the Civil War, Cromwell's government was a coalition, but it included influential Congregationalists like John Owen. However, the religious chaos during this period pushed English Congregationalists to become more conservative. In 1658, about 100 English Congregationalists met at the Savoy Assembly to define their beliefs. They largely agreed with the teachings of the Westminster Assembly, but used the Cambridge Platform from New England as a guide for church government. They hoped for a religious settlement that would allow Presbyterians and Congregationalists to coexist, but the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 and the Act of Uniformity in 1662 ended those hopes, forcing many Congregationalists into the status of religious dissenters. Meanwhile, in New England, the Puritans faced their own challenges. The strict requirement for church membership, only those who could prove a personal experience of God's grace, led to questions about infant baptism. Over time, the churches included adults who had been baptized but couldn't show the same level of devotion as the original settlers. This raised the question: could these adults baptize their own children? The Cambridge Platform had set strict rules, but by the 1650s a new standard emerged, allowing the baptism of children whose parents were baptized but not fully converted. In 1662, the Massachusetts General Court called a synod to address these issues. The solution was the halfway covenant, which allowed churches to baptize the children of baptized adults, even if the parents hadn't had a conversion experience. However, this didn't solve the problem. It only led to more diversity in church practices. Each church could set its own rules, and this created tension among ministers and lay people. The Puritan project in New England, which initially relied on a shared spiritual vision, began to unravel. The original ideals of cooperation and harmony were no longer enough to hold the community together. When England's Court of Chancery revoked Massachusetts Bay's charter in 1684, it formalized the changes that had been happening since the 1650s. The colony lost its independence, and royal governors took control, including oversight of church affairs. This meant that the Puritans could no longer implement their religious ideals as they had before. Despite these challenges, the Puritans' influence continued. Their devotional literature inspired later generations of Calvinists, but it also set high expectations that often led to disappointment. The Puritan vision of a pure church and society was difficult to sustain, especially as the second generation of settlers became less devout. The expansion of Reformed churches into the New World, however, brought new opportunities. In North America and South Africa, Reformed churches enjoyed greater freedom than in Europe. The Dutch Reformed in New Netherland and the Puritans in New England had the chance to experiment with new forms of church life. While these freedoms had their drawbacks, they provided a model for a more voluntary and less state-controlled form of church life. John Philip Bohn's story is a good example of this. He arrived in Pennsylvania in 1720 and found a community of German settlers who were farming and needed a minister. Despite not being ordained, Bohm began to lead services for the Reformed community. He divided the settlers into 3 congregations and started conducting regular worship and sacraments. This marked the beginning of formal German Reformed church life in the New World. Bohm's experience shows how Reformed Protestantism spread through individual and family migrations. These immigrants formed the basis for new Reformed and Presbyterian congregations, which eventually developed into voluntary denominations. Unlike in Europe, where churches often relied on state support, these new churches depended on the goodwill of the people. This model of church life became the most successful way to establish Reformed Protestantism in the New World, and even inspired new forms of church life in Europe. Francis Makemie, born in 1658, was a key figure in the early days of Presbyterianism in North America. His story is intertwined with the broader history of the Scots-Irish people, who played a significant role in shaping American religious life. Makemie was born in County Donegal, Ireland, to Scottish parents who had migrated there as part of the Ulster Plantation. This plantation was a strategic move by the English crown to secure Ireland against potential threats from Catholic European powers. The plan involved settling Protestants, particularly Scots, in Ireland to create a loyal and Protestant population. However, the conditions in Ulster were harsh, much like those in the early English colonies in North America. Despite the challenges, many Scots-Irish found a new home in Ulster, and some, like Makemie, eventually looked to the New World for better opportunities. In 1683, Makemie, now a young man, left his family in Ireland and set sail for Maryland. He had studied divinity at the University of Glasgow and was ordained by the Presbytery of Laggan. Makemie's journey was not just a personal one. It was part of a larger movement of Scots-Irish seeking religious freedom and better economic prospects. When he arrived in Maryland, he found a community of Presbyterians who were eager for spiritual leadership. Makemie's first few years in the New World were spent traveling extensively. He visited Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and even Barbados, conducting religious services and helping to establish Presbyterian congregations. His efforts were crucial in forming the first Presbyterian congregation in Philadelphia, which would later become a significant center for American Presbyterianism. In 1687, McAmee settled in Accomack County, Virginia, where he married Naomi Anderson, the daughter of a merchant and planter. Even with a family, McAmee continued his travels, making 2 trips to London to recruit more ministers and an extended trip to Barbados for both business and church work. One of his most notable journeys was in 1707, when he and another minister traveled to Boston to recruit pastors. During this trip, McAmee preached in New York, which was against the policies of Lord Cornbury. He was briefly imprisoned, but was eventually exonerated. This incident became a symbol of resistance to tyranny and reinforced the link between Reformed Protestantism and the fight for religious freedom. McAmee's influence extended beyond his preaching. He was also involved in commercial activities which helped sustain him and his family. In 1705, he wrote a book titled A Plain and Friendly, Persuasive to the Inhabitants of Virginia and Maryland for Promoting Towns and Cohabitation. In this book, he emphasized the importance of stable and productive communities for the growth of religious congregations. He argued that in remote and scattered settlements, it was difficult to maintain regular church attendance and to ensure that people received proper religious education. The establishment of the first presbytery in the New World in 1706 was a significant milestone. McAmee chose Philadelphia as the location for the first presbytery meeting. The city, founded by Quakers, was known for its religious tolerance and diversity. The presbytery's initial task was to ordain John Boyd, who was starting a congregation in East Jersey. The presbytery also aimed to provide advice and encouragement to ministers, assign texts for preaching, and evaluate each other's performances. Over time, the presbytery's role expanded to include ordaining new ministers and receiving those who transferred. By 1717, the Presbyterian community had grown large enough to form its first synod, the Synod of Philadelphia. This synod included 3 presbyteries and 16 ministers, with the majority of congregations located in the Delaware Valley and the Chesapeake Bay region. The Synod of Philadelphia continued to grow and ordain new ministers, many of whom came from New England and took up charges in New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. The early American Presbyterian Church faced challenges in maintaining unity and coherence. In 1729, the Synod of Philadelphia approved the Church's first constitution and adopted the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms as its doctrinal rule. This decision was not without controversy, as some opposed creedal subscription while others saw it as necessary for maintaining doctrinal purity. Francis McAmee's life and work laid the foundation for the growth of Presbyterianism in America. His travels, preaching, and leadership helped establish a strong and resilient church that would continue to shape American religious life for generations to come. The early American Presbyterian Church faced a lot of challenges, especially when it came to deciding who could become a minister. In 1729, the church leaders had to figure out how to balance strict rules with the need for ministers to have some freedom of thought. They came up with the Adopting Act, which said that ministers had to agree with the main teachings of the Westminster Confession, a set of beliefs that Presbyterians followed. However, they could disagree on some less important points. This was a way to keep the church united while allowing for some differences. Despite this effort, the church still had problems. One big issue was the Great Awakening, a religious revival that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s. Some ministers, like the Tennant family, were very enthusiastic about the revivals and encouraged emotional, passionate worship. They even set up a school, the Log College, to train new ministers who would promote these revivals. Other ministers, who had been trained at prestigious universities in Scotland and New England, were more traditional and thought the revivals were too chaotic and disruptive. The tension between these two groups led to a split in 1741. The pro-revival group became known as the New Side, and the anti-revival group became the Old Side. The New Side was led by the Tennants and other revivalists, while the Old Side was led by more traditional ministers. The split caused a lot of conflict and made it hard for the church to function smoothly. However, in 1758, the two sides decided to come back together. They agreed that while the revivalists had sometimes broken church rules, they had also done important work in spreading the gospel. The Old Side, on the other hand, had been right to try to maintain order, but had sometimes been too rigid. This compromise helped to heal the divide and allowed the church to move forward. Another important figure in this period was John Witherspoon, a Scottish minister who came to America in 1768 to be the president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. Witherspoon was a strong supporter of the American Revolution and even signed the Declaration of Independence. He was also a key leader in the Presbyterian Church, working to create a more organized structure for the church. In 1789, the First General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, PCUSA, was held in Philadelphia. This assembly brought together ministers and elders from different parts of the country to form a national church. The new church structure was designed to be flexible and decentralized. While the General Assembly had some authority, most of the power remained with the local presbyteries, which were groups of ministers and elders from specific regions. This structure allowed each congregation to have a lot of freedom in how they ran their church, but it also provided a way for the church to work together on important issues. Meanwhile, German Reformed Protestants were also establishing themselves in Pennsylvania. Many of these settlers had come from the Palatinate region in Germany, where they had faced war, poverty, and religious persecution. In America, they found a place where they could practice their faith more freely. One of the key figures in organizing these German Reformed congregations was John Philip Boehm, a former school teacher who became a minister. Boehm helped to set up the first 4 German Reformed congregations in Pennsylvania and established rules for church governance and worship. However, Boehm's authority was challenged by George Michael Weiss, a pastor who arrived in 1727 with a group of German settlers. Weiss had proper ordination from the consistory of Heidelberg, but Boehm did not. This led to a conflict over who had the right to lead the congregations. The dispute was eventually resolved when Boehm appealed to the Dutch Reformed Church in Amsterdam, which recognized his work and ordained him in 1729. After this, Boehm and Weiss were able to work together with each minister leading the congregations he had established. These early conflicts and compromises shaped the development of the Presbyterian and Reformed churches in America. Despite the challenges, these churches grew and became an important part of American religious life. They continued to adapt to the changing needs of their members while maintaining their core beliefs and practices. The story of the German Reformed churches in America is a tale of perseverance, conflict, and growth. When the first German settlers arrived in Pennsylvania, they brought with them their faith, traditions, and a deep commitment to their Reformed beliefs. But building a new church in a new land was not easy. They faced challenges from internal disagreements to external pressures, but through it all they managed to lay the foundation for a vibrant and enduring faith community. One of the earliest challenges came when a fundraising trip to Holland went awry. Jacob Rife, one of the elders, misused the funds meant to support the colonists. This left the community without much needed financial assistance and created tension within the congregation. But the real test came when the Moravians, led by Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, arrived in 1741. Zinzendorf had a vision of uniting all German Protestants under one church, but his methods and practices, such as baptizing by pouring water on a child's chest, were controversial. Reverend Christopher Bohm, a key figure in the German Reformed community, strongly opposed these practices and wrote letters to his peers to explain his concerns. Despite the opposition, Zinzendorf's influence led to the formation of the Pennsylvania Synod, a gathering of various Protestant groups. However, the Synod eventually disbanded, and the Reformed and Lutheran churches continued to grow independently. In 1746, Michael Schlatter arrived from Amsterdam with a mission to stabilize the Reformed churches in Pennsylvania. Schlatter was well educated and respected, and he quickly gained the trust of the German settlers. He brought the existing pastors together and helped them put aside their past differences. This led to the formation of the Philadelphia Coetus, a governing body for the Reformed churches. Bohm, who had initially faced many challenges, was elected as its president. The Coetus adopted the Heidelberg Catechism and Canons of Dort, which provided a clear statement of their beliefs. However, the growth of the Reformed community also brought new challenges. Schlatter returned to Europe in 1751 to raise funds and recruit more ministers. He came back with additional pastors and financial support, but the introduction of English language schools caused tension. Many German Reformed members wanted to preserve their language and culture, and the schools were seen as a threat. This led to Schlatter's dismissal from his role in the Coetus, and he spent the rest of his life as a teacher and chaplain. Despite these setbacks, the German Reformed community continued to grow and spread throughout Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. By the late 18th century, the need for more pastors and the desire for independence from Dutch oversight became pressing. In 1793, the German Reformed churches in America declared their independence and formed their own synod. This new synod, free from the constraints of the Dutch Church, was better equipped to meet the needs of the growing German community. The journey of the German Reformed churches in America is a testament to the resilience and adaptability of faith. From the early conflicts and challenges to the establishment of a self-governing synod, the German Reformed community showed that they could thrive in a new land. They preserved their heritage while also embracing the opportunities and freedoms of the new world. Their story is a reminder that faith can flourish in the most unexpected places, and that the challenges we face can often lead to greater strength and unity.